Atheist Nomads episode 437, Bad Things Jesus Taught, with David Madison.
The podcast you're about to listen to includes cursing and talking about hoo-haws. Please be advised.
Welcome to another episode of Atheist Nomads. I am Dustin, and in a little bit, I'll be joined by David Madison. He's a former Methodist minister with a PhD in biblical studies. And he published a book recently titled 10 Things Christians Wish Jesus Hadn't Taught, and Other Reasons to Question His Words. It's a good discussion, so look forward to that. Just got a little bit of housekeeping before we get to the interview. Right now, we are in the middle of the December sale on the store. So this is going through the 17th of December. And if you're late, it might still be going. $14 t-shirts and everything else is up to 30% off, and you can find that at atheistnomads.com/store. Next week's episode is going to be our annual War on Christmas. So that one will be fun because it will be looking into how Christmas works out in the Middle East and some problems that are happening there. So, little teaser for that. But let's go ahead and get on to the interview. We are now joined by David Madison, who just published a book a few months ago, 10 Things Christians Wish Jesus Hadn't Taught. All right, so let's start off with your background. So you're a former minister. What denomination did you come from?
Methodist.
All right. And with the in-process Methodist schism, which side would you say you would be on if you were still in the Methodist Church?
Oh my, I'm not keeping up with Methodist schisms any more than I keep up with other schisms. Christianity has schismed all over the place for hundreds of years.
Oh yeah, it's one of my favorite topics. Getting to see one in real time is just awesome.
I was raised in northern Indiana. I was born in 1942. My mother was pious. She was conservative, but she was not a fundamentalist.
Okay.
And I remember vividly, she could not stand to watch Billy Graham.
All right.
She thought he was a phony. My father was a doctor. Both my parents believed in evolution.
Mm-hmm.
They would have thought it was eccentric not to believe in evolution. My mother was a voracious reader. She never graduated from college, never went to college. But all the many years I knew her, she read voraciously. History, biography. This was her thing. And she instilled that in me. And as a matter of fact, when I was a teenager, she bought the 12-volume Interpreter's Bible, which was a product of liberal Protestant scholarship, and it was designed for the clergy. 12 volumes. She bought that. She brought that into our home. And so that was some of my primary reading material when I was a teenager. A new minister came to our church, was assigned to our church, and she asked him a question about something she'd read in the Interpreter's Bible, and he said, "You own the Interpreter's Bible?" He was astounded. But in fact, it was when I went away to college is when I first really bumped into fundamentalists, evangelicals, the InterVarsity Christian Fellowship.
Right. Because you would have been growing up in a liberal Methodist environment that would have, or relatively liberal by especially by modern standards, Methodist environment that wouldn't have class, would have been very mainstream.
Yes. I wouldn't call it liberal. I would call it moderate. There was certainly nothing radical or strident about it. But the more I study, I look back now on some of the papers I wrote, even when I was in college. I wrote a long paper for a couple of my professors in religion, explaining why the virgin birth of Jesus was not legitimate doctrine. It didn't make sense. It was based on fable. Mm-hmm. And I went with that mindset to Boston University. And it was, Ironically enough, it was Boston University School of Theology where I lost my faith. Or as Dan Savage says, I didn't lose my faith, I saw through it. Because the more you study the Bible, unless you're really committed to what I call the ancient Jesus mystery cult, unless you're really committed to that, you're devoted to it, it's in your blood. I saw through it.
I'm a seminary dropout.
Oh, good.
I was in the Issues and Origins class, basically Creationist Propaganda class at the Seventh Adventist Theological Seminary, looking around the room at who had in their eyes, this is complete and utter bullshit, and who were just eating it up. And it was about a 50-50 split.
That's interesting. You should say 50-50. A few years ago, I was in conversation with a prominent Italian television correspondent, and he was an atheist. And I said to him point blank, tell me how many of these the clerics in the Roman Catholic Church, the higher ups, how many of them actually believe what they're teaching? And he said maybe 50%. He said, for the church, it's a business. It's a business.
Yeah.
And you got to look at it that way.
Yeah, and I had professors at the seminary who they talked about their doubts and struggles, and I actually pulled each of them aside, and because I was dealing with the same struggles and had private conversations with them about, how did you reconcile it? And they all said, well, already was married, already had kids, and already had his paycheck. So you figure out how to accept it on existential grounds and just be a part of the community. And one of them is a very ardent, outspoken creationist apologist. He doesn't believe any of it. He doesn't believe a damn word. No.
Oh my gosh. It's a paycheck.
It's a paycheck.
Amazing.
Yeah.
But by the time I'd finished my PhD in biblical studies, I knew I was an atheist. I didn't believe it. And I kind of figured out that an atheist wouldn't do well in the Methodist ministry. Right. So that's when I actually, the last congregation I served, there was a young man there who was a gung-ho insurance salesman. And of course, when you're a minister, you know a lot of people. So he was confident that I would do well selling insurance. And so he arranged for an interview with me with the head of his division of New York Life. And I got the job. And I'll never forget the first day on the job, they handed me a huge form with 200 blanks on it. It said, who do you know? That's what they expected me to do was call as many of my former parishioners as possible to try to get appointments to sell insurance. It's probably the year of my life I loathed the most, even more than I had come to detest the Sunday morning worship services. But I succeeded. I sold $1 million worth of insurance, and then I had to get out and do something else. But that was 1977, 78. But, now there's the Clergy Project.
Right.
Are you familiar with it? Okay. Yeah. Which it's an online supports system for clergy who are no longer believers. Didn't have anything like that back then. I had to make my own way, figure out what to do.
Wow. So how long were you serving in churches?
9 years.
9 years. So
two parishes.
And so you were almost an atheist by the end of grad school, and then definitely an atheist by the end of your doctorate.
That was the trend. That was the trend. And
the churches were in between the two?
The churches were one right after the other. But I don't know whether you're familiar with the name Paul Tillick. Paul Tillick was a prominent theologian at the time. And
I think I have one of his books on the bookshelf.
And he became very, very famous. and he wrote a lot of theology which no layperson in the world could read. Theologians write for other theologians, and he said that God is the ground of all being. Well, if I'd stood up in my church and said, God is the ground of all being, everybody in the parish would have looked at me as if I was crazy.
Oh, absolutely.
They came into worship every Sunday, the man upstairs,
Mm-hmm.
to sing songs to the man upstairs, to ask favors, to say their prayers.
Yeah.
It was a lot of theologians get annoyed when atheists talk about the old man in the sky, but believe me, that's the concept that so many Christians have of God.
And the average Christian in the pews thinks studying theology is learning how to be a pastor.
Yeah.
Because their pastor has a degree in theology, usually.
Yeah, exactly.
You talk to a theologian, what's theology? It's arguing about ridiculous minutia. And of course, what atheists will say about what Christians believe is going to be different than what theologians would say, because theologians have been spending 2,000 years trying to figure out how to make it so incredibly convoluted and asinine that nobody can make sense of what they're saying.
Well, theology is theologians analyzing the theological position of other theologians.
Yeah.
Okay? And debating it and disagreeing with each other.
Mm-hmm.
That's why there's more than 30,000 Christian denominations, sects, factions, cults now, because nobody can agree.
Absolutely.
And one of the things I say constantly in my articles on the Debunking Christianity blog is, this is a challenge we issue to theists. Please show us, please tell us where we can find reliable, verifiable, objective data about gods. One condition: all believers, all theists must agree, yes, this is where you can find it. And that will never happen.
Oh.
Because the most devout Jewish theologians you could find will deny that the New Testament is revelation.
Mm-hmm.
Nobody in the Christian church is about to say, let's open up the Bible and include the Quran.
Yeah.
Because they don't believe that Muslim theologians have it right either. And nobody believes that they should open up the Bible to include the Book of Mormon. Everybody knows those folks are crazy.
Absolutely.
So where can we find the reliable, verifiable data about God? It really drove home to me the inadequacy of theology. One day in a theology class, one of our professors, and again, this is referring to a theologian who was a contemporary of Paul Tillick, Karl Barth. Does that name ring a bell?
Absolutely. Yeah.
There was a point, I think, in the 1960s, that Karl Barth had his picture on the cover of Time magazine. And over the course of 30 years, he wrote a 13 or 14 volume theology of Christian theology called Church Dogmatics. And he was Swiss, so all this was written in German. And one day my professor, a bit of playfulness, said, nobody knows 8,000 pages about God, not even in German. And then you stop to think, well, yeah, that's kind of absurd to write 8,000 pages about God. But that prompts the question, well, here, I'm going to hand you a sheet of paper. On one sheet of paper, tell me just fill up one page with what you know about God. That's the challenge. And demonstrate to us how you know that. What is your epistemology? What is what are the reliable, verifiable data upon which you base these conclusions that you've written down on this one piece of paper?
Mm-hmm.
And, you start thinking about that. And many years later, Sam Harris would write that theology must now be considered a branch of human ignorance. And that's just the way it is. No theologian can tell you where to find the reliable, verifiable, objective data about God.
Yeah, absolutely.
You know the story of George Lemaitre?
That one doesn't ring a bell.
He was a physicist and a Catholic priest. And after Einstein was puzzled by his own calculation, because according to his own calculation, the universe should be expanding.
Mm-hmm.
And that didn't make sense. How could that be? And then Edwin Hubble came along in the 1920s, and with his hard work as an astronomer, he was able to prove, he found the evidence
Mm-hmm.
that the Milky Way is not, the Milky Way galaxy is not the universe. He proved that Andromeda, that smudge of light,
Mm-hmm.
was in fact another galaxy, some 2 million light years away. So he proved that the universe was humongous.
Yeah.
And of course, the Hubble Space Telescope has just driven home that point to the extreme. But Georges Lemaitre, the Catholic priest who was also a physicist, he was the one who took all this in, and he said, wait a minute, the universe is expanding, because Hubble had shown that the further away a galaxy is, the greater the redshift. It's going away from us.
Mm-hmm.
And so it was Lemaitre who suggested that eons ago there had been what he called a singularity, an explosion, boom. Something like 20 years later, another astronomer who didn't have any use for this concept called it the Big Bang. And of course, that name has stuck since, the Big Bang. And the Pope was ready to jump in and say, aha, this is proof of creation, the Big Bang, God did it. And Georges Lemaitre took the Pope aside and said, don't go there, because it's not a good idea, because Georges Lemaitre knew that they didn't know what caused it.
Yeah.
And you can jump in and say, oh, God did it.
And then you have a God of the gaps that will always shrink.
Constantly. And I can't remember whether the Pope backed down or not, but Lemaitre, even being a Catholic priest, was smart enough to know, don't start sticking God in there when you don't have the answer.
Yeah.
So, and all this was tumbling around in my mind, even when I was in seminary. One of the things that occurred to me is, look at where we are in the cosmos. Just look at where we are in the cosmos. It is so vast. And we're stuck on this little planet. Carl Sagan would later call it the pale blue dot. And here we are on the surface of this biosphere, making all sorts of pronouncements about God. Why are we in a position? How are we in a position to do that? There might be thousands, hundreds of thousands of thinking civilizations
Mm-hmm.
out there that have been studying and analyzing and researching the cosmos 20 or 30 or 50 times longer than we have. And we don't have their input on, if you took a survey of, say, 50 of the thinking civilizations out there and said, tell us your views about God. Would they laugh at us? Would they say, oh, get over it? We don't know. And yet here our theologians will write hundreds, thousands, millions of books, articles, doctoral dissertations about God.
Yeah.
Based on what? Zero.
Yeah. All right. So you wrote a book.
Yes.
And
I wrote 2.
Oh, 2 books.
Yes.
What was the first one?
The first one is 2016. It was called 10 Tough Problems in Christian Thought and Belief. A minister turned atheist shows why you should ditch the faith. And even after I left the ministry, these thoughts were churning around in my mind. I'm saying, how do people still believe this? So I listed, one of the most common reactions I get to that title, 10 Tough Problems, people saying, what, only 10? And what I had done was I just swept a lot of the problems into these 10 categories. And the 9th category was, what a friend we don't have in Jesus. And that gave birth to this second book that was published in August.
Very nice. 10 things Christians wish Jesus hadn't taught.
And other reasons to question his words. And as I got ready to do this book, I thought, well, let me reread the Gospels for the umpteenth time in my 79 years. And I said, let me write all these down carefully, thoroughly, and I put them on an Excel spreadsheet. Came to 292 Jesus quotes that are not really very good. And I divided them into a few categories like, because I've forgotten these categories already, but apocalypticism, cult extremism, bad advice and bad theology, and then finally the unreal Jesus of John's gospel. But then my editor, Tim Sledge, he looked at these, he looked at all these sayings and he said, there's a better way to organize this. I think he was somewhat influenced by the title of my first book, and he came up with 10 things Christians wish Jesus hadn't taught. And when you really stop to think about it, if Christians didn't know Jesus had said these things, they would say, give me a break. I don't believe that.
Right.
I don't follow that at all. That's nonsense. That's absurd. That's ridiculous. Except for evangelicals who will go along with it unthinkingly.
Evangelicals who right now will go along with anything if it's divorced from reality.
But priests and preachers, of course, from the pulpit, they will talk about the feel-good verses that they find in the Gospels or in the writings of Paul, or scattered.
Like John 11's a really popular one, despite the fact that it wasn't in there until much later.
John 11 or John 8?
The woman thrown at Jesus' feet.
Yeah, that's John 8.
Oh, sorry. Yeah. Okay. John 8. Yeah.
That's another problem entirely, how we got the Bible, because all the original manuscripts were lost. But Tim helped me come up with these 10 different categories for these 10 categories of things Christians wish Jesus hadn't said. And if you could really get Christians to read the Gospels carefully, critically, they would come across so many Jesus sayings. I came up with 292 where they would say, I don't agree with that. That's absurd. That's ridiculous. That's terrible. It's bad theology. It's bad advice. And Tim and I put them into 10 categories. And the book is, what is it? The book is 125 pages long.
All right.
It's designed to be read in one sitting, 2 sittings at most. It's designed to be easily accessible. I don't go into a lot of theological jargon. It's meant to be addressed to the lay reader. And the challenge is, Christians may say, well, how dare you claim to know that these are things we wish Jesus hadn't said? My response is, take a look at them. Take a look at it. For instance, one of my chapters is on the really bad advice that Jesus gave on divorce. And evangelicals get divorced as much as anybody else does.
Yeah. Yeah.
Okay.
All right. Yeah. The divorce advice is, that is bad. All right. What's another one? Another one of the categories.
Well, I lead off with the first chapter is called "Be Careful Not to Love Too Much," and my favorite story in that chapter, Luke 14:26. That has to be the big stumbling block for any Christian. Jesus says, "If you want to be my disciple, you have to hate your family."
Mm-hmm.
And he lists father, son, brother, sister, mother. You have to hate your family, and you have to hate your life.
Yeah.
To be one of my disciples. What's that about? And Christians will inevitably say, well, Jesus couldn't have meant that. And my response is twofold. Unless you are an expert on ancient Greek and Aramaic, Greek, the language the gospel was written in, and Aramaic, the language that Jesus spoke, unless you are an expert on those languages, I'm not going to respect your opinion as to what Jesus meant. How do you know that? How do you get inside his head? But the second thing that really is a barrier there is Luke reported that Jesus said it.
Mm-hmm.
Now, why would he do that? Why would this strident, horrible text be included in Luke's gospel. This verse comes right after the parable of the Great Banquet, where the host was throwing a big dinner, great banquet, and all the people who he had invited begged off at the last minute. They all had excuses. Oh, we can't come to your banquet. So the Lord of the manor sent his servants, his slaves, out into the city, out into the byways, out into the alleys and lanes to bring in whomever he could, the lame, the blind. He wanted to fill his table. What a great story that is. To be in the kingdom of God, you don't have to have special societal status. Mm-hmm. Everybody is welcome. But I think Luke wanted to say, whether this was a parable from Jesus or not, we have no way of knowing. But Luke wanted to say, not so fast. The early Jesus cult, there are standards. There are rules. We don't want people who are lukewarm. Mm-hmm. We don't want people who consider allegiance to family more important than allegiance to our cult, to our sect. There's the other famous verse where a man says he wants to follow Jesus, but first let me go home and bury my father. Jesus said, let the dead bury their dead. Come and follow me. Surely that's a saying that most Christians would say, wait a minute, that's not good at all. That's terrible.
Yeah. I've actually heard sermons with that verse being used. Mm-hmm. And tried to be spun in a positive light of, but of course you can only spin that in a positive way by turning it into a parable.
Well,
if you take it literally.
I tell people, I advise Christians, if you want to find out what the Bible is all about, there are many resources to do that. But the resource that you don't want to depend upon is your priest or preacher. Mm-hmm. Why? Because your priest or preacher is a paid propagandist mm-hmm. for the Jesus cult. Pardon me for calling it a cult, but that's what it is. It may be humongous. It may have this tremendous worldwide monumental bureaucracy, but it's still a cult. And your priest or preacher has gone to seminary, has received training to be a paid propagandist for his denomination.
And Christianity is specifically an apocalyptic death cult.
And I cover that in my 10th chapter. And your priest or preacher is a paid propagandist. Yeah. That's how they earn their living. They are paid to do that. You will never find a Catholic priest stand up on Sunday morning and argue for the correctness of the Mormon faith.
Or the fallibility of the Pope. No, they won't.
The priest is not going to say, I had some Mormon missionaries calling me the other day, and you know what? They've got it right. And I've brought these Mormon missionaries into Mass this morning to tell you which is the right religion. They're not going to do that. They are there to therefore, they are Spinmeisters. Mm-hmm. As you say, they can, first of all, they're not going to bring up Luke 14:26 in the pulpit. They're usually not going to bring up, let the dead bury their dead. They're going to focus on more feel-good verses. And if anybody in the parish does bother to read the Gospels and comes to the priest or the preacher and says, wait a minute, I found this in the Gospels, and I find this very upsetting, they are trained to spin it in the most possible mm-hmm. light. Or, what's the favorite excuse? It's a mystery.
Yeah. Well, like the Creationist Propaganda class that I took, that was specifically created because Adventist pastors were getting confronted by people who had actual evidence and information about evolution mm-hmm. and had no answers about it. Or more accurately, were getting asked questions by church members whose kids were learning about it in science class and didn't know anything to even be able to argue against it. And so the class was created to give you as much propaganda as you could use to try to poke holes in the argument.
Yeah.
And that's all it was. It was a class. It was a propaganda class.
Yeah.
And not a very convincing one at that.
Well, I often call the church a monumental bureaucracy with a couple of thousand years of momentum. Yeah. And how many hundreds of thousands of buildings do we have around the United States alone designed to enhance this cult, to make it look respectable, to make it look believable. Before the pandemic, I went to a Catholic funeral. Oh my! It was just the priest standing up there and reciting all this propaganda, and then at the end, the people in the congregation faithfully walking up to the front to get the little piece of the body of their Lord to eat.
Mm-hmm.
Are you out of your minds? I want to say, you're eating your God? Of course, that's based on the 6th chapter of John, where Jesus, according to John's script, Jesus says, my blood is true drink and my flesh is true food. And if you eat my flesh and drink my blood, you have eternal life. That is just cult weirdness. Come on.
It really is.
It's sick. It's magical thinking. It's going a step beyond Harry Potter. Here's a potion. You eat this and you drink this and you get to live forever.
Well, and the early church, some of the evidence out for what that was like, they would have a service on Friday night, and then they'd have a service on Saturday while they didn't eat, a full day fast. And then Sunday morning, they would, hiding in the sewers during times of persecution, would drink blood and eat flesh.
Mm-hmm.
So the non-Christians around them thought that they were a cannibalistic cult, eating people in the sewers.
And the Catholic Church, in its wisdom, eventually came up with the idea of transubstantiation.
Mm-hmm.
Because if Jesus has gone away, he's ascended into heaven, according to Acts 1, right?
Mm-hmm.
Is he still in orbit? If he's gone away, then how do you eat his flesh and drink his blood? It's the miracle of the Mass.
Mm-hmm.
And there was the priest raising the host. The bell goes off. The miracle of the Mass. This piece of bread, this bit of wine. These are miraculously transformed into the actual body and blood of Jesus. And people go up and eat it and drink it. Folks, come on. You're living in the 21st century. Snap out of it.
Well, and then when you get into the kind of theology of the bread and the wine, it's transubstantiation. It's still physically bread and wine. Its true essence,
yes,
is the body and blood, which is straight out of Plato. It's full-on Platonic mind games.
Yeah, absolutely. Let me recite some of the topics in this, if that's okay.
Yeah, absolutely.
Some of these categories of things that people wish Jesus hadn't said. Be careful not to love too much. That's where I discuss Luke 14:26. Do not worry about basic human needs. And here we have some really strange advice in the Sermon on the Mount. Don't worry about what you eat. Don't worry about what you drink. Don't worry about what you wear. All these will be provided for you by God. And another bit of really bad advice in the Sermon on the Mount, chapter 3, never say no to a borrower. Never refuse someone who begs from you. If someone sues you, give them more than what they sue you for. Do not lay up for yourselves treasures on earth. Really? How many Christians have pension plans?
Yeah.
This is really bad advice. Then chapter 4 is give me everything. It sounds so nice when you hear it from the pulpit or when you see it in stained glass or on greeting cards. You shall love the Lord your God with all your heart and all your mind and all your soul and all your strength. That's cult fanaticism, loving God. Give me everything. Then remarrying after divorce. I mean, it's a good idea. God created them male and female. It's a good concept for the ongoing survival of the human race. But then Jesus adds those whom God hath joined together, let no man put asunder. You mean God has arranged every single marriage since marriage was invented? Every single one? We can all look around us and see bad marriages, mistake marriages, horrible marriages. God did that? It's bad theology. It's bad advice.
Well, if you look at it from the Calvinistic perspective, then yes, God ordained everything.
Yeah. And then you're into a whole bunch of other theological problems.
Yeah.
You are accountable for every word you utter on the day of judgment. Really? There are so many of these kinds of sayings which amount to what I call monotheistic totalitarianism. God is watching everything you do and say. It's like having closed-circuit television cameras in every room in your house, including the bedroom and the bathroom.
Mm-hmm.
Do you really endorse that kind of God who spies on everything and holds you accountable for everything? Doesn't make sense.
Yeah.
You can do, chapter 7 is you can do magic, and here I talk about Jesus and what he says about prayer. Whenever 2 or 3 of you are gathered together in my name, whatever you ask will be given to you. It's magical thinking.
Mm-hmm.
And most Christians know from their own experience that that's not how prayer works. Chapter 8 is about, I don't want everyone to understand me. Say what? Well, in the 4th chapter of Mark, Jesus says, I teach in parables to fool people.
Yeah.
I teach in parables so that they will not repent and be saved. What is that about? In fact, I wrote a whole long paper on that in seminary. It's called The Messianic Secret. It makes no sense. And in the same chapter 4 of Mark, it states that Jesus taught only in parables, no other method. Well, if you read the Gospels carefully, you'll see that John doesn't have Jesus teach in parables at all.
Right.
He teaches in long, tedious monologues, no parables.
Well, there's some evidence that by the time John was written, there were heresies that needed to be specifically addressed, as Gnosticism was just starting to develop.
Yeah.
The parables were confusing, and they needed to be more clear.
Do what I say, or I will hurt you. Now, if you want an idea of what that's about, read Mark 13, the little apocalypse. In Matthew, I can't remember what chapter, Jesus sends out his disciples to preach. And he says, go into the villages and the towns.
Mm-hmm.
And if there are any villages or any towns, any houses that will not accept you, will not listen to what you had to say, kick the dust from your feet and leave. And Jesus says, on the day of judgment, they'll suffer the same fate as Sodom and Gomorrah. They were burned to the ground. So if you don't listen to itinerant preachers knocking on your door, God's going to burn your house down. That's what Jesus is saying.
Yeah.
And that's a challenge I put to any Christians who will not welcome Jehovah's Witnesses or Mormons who knock at their door. What if one of these missionaries turned around and said, just you wait, God's going to burn down your house?
Yeah. Or just take off wouldn't he recognize it if one of them took off their shoes and tapped the dust off on their doorstep? This
is what I cover in this chapter. Do what I say, or I will hurt you.
Mm-hmm.
And then the last judgment scene, I believe Matthew 25, separating the sheep from the goats. When was it I saw you hungry and I fed you, et cetera, et cetera. Well, that's the nice part. They're welcome into the kingdom. But the people who didn't show enough compassion, they're sent into eternal fire. Do what I say, or I will hurt you. But nowhere in that chapter does it list really horrible sins, like owning slaves,
right,
or raping children. Some of the really horrible sins aren't even mentioned in that chapter. And then the 10th chapter is, I will return in your lifetime. In Mark's gospel, in the trial scene, Jesus tells the people at his trial, you will see me coming on the clouds of heaven.
Yeah.
Now, this is probably based on Paul's theology we find stated most bluntly and most horribly in 1 Thessalonians chapter 4, in which Paul promises people in his congregation that even their dead relatives will rise to meet Jesus in the air.
Mm-hmm.
And Paul says that he will be there to join them. For Paul, it was urgent.
Yeah.
For Paul, it wasn't the return of Jesus for Paul. We don't have any confidence at all that Paul believed that Jesus actually walked the earth. He might have been, in Paul's hallucinating brain, a celestial being entirely. But Jesus was going to come on the clouds, and Paul was going to be there to welcome him. This is just plain wrong. It's been falsified by history.
Well, and Paul even went as far as to say, don't bother getting married or having children because there isn't time. Jesus
and even
is
if you're
coming any
married,
day.
Even if you're married, forget about having relations with your wife. You're supposed to be purifying yourself, getting ready to meet Jesus in the air.
In a couple days or weeks or months. Yeah.
Yeah. My fantasy is Paul getting on his deathbed, or whether he was executed many years later, and wondering and saying to himself as the axe is about to fall, Jesus, why didn't you show up? Then I have the longest chapter of the book explains why. I've gone on the theory in this book that Christians are willing to take the words of Jesus verbatim, literally, as they're written in the Gospels. You believe the Gospels inspired? You believe they're the Word of God? These are the words of Jesus. But there's an escape route. There's an escape valve, because most New Testament scholars outside of evangelicals appreciate the fact we have no way of knowing. We have no way whatever of knowing what Jesus actually taught, because there is no contemporaneous documentation for any of his quotes. The parallel example I use is, what if a historian wants to show what happened at Gettysburg the day Lincoln went there to speak? You look at letters, you look at diaries, you look at newspaper accounts, you look at White House archives to establish for sure exactly what Lincoln did and said that day. Nothing, absolutely nothing like that exists for Jesus. What you have is Gospels that were written decades later by theologians who were trying to convince people that Jesus was the resurrected Lord and Savior. That was their goal. They were not historians. They were propagandists.
Yeah.
And New Testament scholars have not yet arrived at a methodology for determining what bits of the Gospels might possibly be historical. And I give 4 reasons in this chapter about why there is this, this barrier between us and the real words of Jesus. And then finally, my last chapter, I issue a challenge. Please, Christians, if you think the Gospels are the Word of God, then read them. And here's my challenge. Instead of going home tonight to watch a movie or to watch a basketball or a baseball game, just say to yourself, I'm going to read the Gospel of Mark straight through, beginning to end. Don't stop until I've read the whole thing. It takes about as much time as watching a movie if you do it carefully. Then I say, take a pause and drink a big glass of wine. Trust me, you'll need the wine, because the next part of the assignment is read the Gospel of John straight through without stopping, the whole thing. It'll take longer. And you'll need the wine because it's 2 different Jesuses. It's 2 different persons, because Mark the theologian wrote maybe 40 years after the death of Jesus. John the theologian wrote maybe 70 or 80 years after the death of Jesus. And his theology had just exploded. I call it theology inflation. In Mark, Jesus shows up out of nowhere to be baptized by John the Baptist for the remission of sins, by the way. And a voice from heaven announces, "This is my beloved Son." This is Mark's theology. That was the point at which Jesus was adopted. A few decades later, John comes along and says, whoa, Jesus was present at creation. So this Galilean peasant preacher was present at creation, and through him, everything was made. Nothing was made that was not made through him. It's really bombastic, off the charts theology inflation. And if Christians really bothered to read the Gospels carefully, they would see that.
Mm-hmm. I did a seminar on Gnosticism when I was in the seminary, and I had the distinction by the end of my classmates calling me the Gnostic, because I actually tried to read them to understand where the people were coming from and what they believed, where everybody else was reading heresy, trying to figure out ways to argue against it.
Mm-hmm.
It was long gone. There was no point in arguing against it. It was fascinating to see these things these people believed. But what was interesting was a lot of these Gnostic scriptures had genealogies of the gods.
Mm.
And the Old Testament God, Yahweh, was the bad, evil God. And wisdom and the Word and Jesus were good gods. But the Word, God, and Jesus were all different.
Mm.
And so John actually made a point. This was probably a kind of a argument against proto-Gnosticism of the Word was God.
Theologians, they make things up as they go along.
Yeah. And and Gnosticism was very much when they wrote the genealogies in the scriptures, being creative was encouraged.
Mm.
So differences were common, and the complexities increased every time.
The Gospels are a product of human imagination.
Mm-hmm.
Before we end, I'll tell you a little parable I've come up with. Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John are all waiting at a bar for notification of which gospel is going to be allowed into the New Testament. The New Testament committee has read them all, is making that decision. They don't like each other. They disagree with each other, but they've gathered at the bar for this occasion. And they all get texts at the same time. And the text says, "Congratulations, the four of you. We've decided to include all four Gospels, and we're going to print them back to back." And the four authors are horrified. That's the worst thing that can happen. And indeed. And don't forget, for 1,500 years, lay people did not have access to reading the Bible.
Right.
Okay? So the divine Jesus was what they were taught for so many years, but for so many centuries. But now when you have serious scholars, serious historians, what could be handier than to have these four contradictory Gospels back to back? So you can read them side by side and see how drastically they differ.
Well, even when you just look at Jesus' birth and death, his birth, between the two accounts of that, is two events 9 years apart, with different cities and places and starting and ending points. And his death, if you count up Peter's denials, they all agree he denied Jesus 3 times. There's 5 separate denials.
In my upcoming article on Christmas Eve on the Debunking Christianity blog, I think the article is going to be "Get Those Wise Men Out of the Manger." And I was in Italy a few months ago, and I went into a church not too far from Milan, and there was the Christ scene, the birth scene, with the shepherds and the wise men. No. If you read the Gospels, you will see that the wise men showed up when Jesus was a toddler.
Yeah.
I mean, there are so many contradictions and plot flaws in the story. But of course, they get merged for the church pageant on Christmas Eve.
Mm-hmm.
And the people and the folks in the pews don't bother to read the stories carefully. And of course, the stories of the death and resurrection of Jesus in the 4 Gospels are a mess. So many contradictions, so many inconsistencies. Can't make sense of them. That's why I say, I always quote Mark Twain. the best cure for Christianity is reading the Bible. And that's absolutely true. If you read it, he said, it's not the parts of the Bible I don't understand that bother me. It's the parts of the Bible that I do understand that bother me. But the clergy count on the lay people not reading the Bible.
Yeah.
They count on it. They count on it.
Yep, absolutely. Well, on that note, thank you so much for joining us. Where can people find your book?
It's on Amazon. The book's website, by the way, is www.badthingsjesustaught.com.
All right.
Badthingsjesustaught.com.
And where can people find your blog?
It's not my blog. It's the Debunking Christianity blog. It's done by John Loftus. But I've been writing for it now for 4 years. Every Friday I publish an article, and that's www.debunking-christianity.com.
All right.
And people should check out John Loftus as well. Just do a search on Amazon for John W. Loftus, and you'll see all of his books. And also for my publisher, Tim Sledge, who wrote a book called Goodbye Jesus. It's the story of his walking away from evangelicalism. And he also wrote a book, 4 Disturbing Questions with One Simple Answer, Breaking the Spell of Christian Belief. And it's about the same format and size of this book, very easy reading, and it's just 4 hard-hitting questions that Christians can't answer. So,
all right, very nice.
And one final plug. Also, www.cureforchristianity.com. That's where I maintain my Cure for Christianity library, which now has more than 525 titles that on the falsification of theism, Christianity especially. So if people want resources,
nice.
There's a fantastic resource.
All right. Well, thank you very much.
Thank you.
Yeah, no feedback this week. But if you want to reach out to us, you can always send us messages via email at feedback@atheistnomads.com. You could use the contact form on the website or hit us up on social media. Be aware, though, that on Twitter, there is a bot that grabs that to put in the show notes to make sure that we cover it. And if you post it to Facebook, I don't know when I'll be seeing that. So email is and the feedback form and SpeakPipe are the best options. And if you want to support the show, you can find out how at atheistnomads.com/donate and either do a one-time donation through PayPal or support us on a per-episode basis on Patreon. So until next week, remember, not all those who wander are lost. Thank you for listening to another episode of Atheist Nomads. You can find show notes and contact information at atheistnomads.com. Follow us on Twitter at Atheist Nomads, and like us on Facebook at facebook.com/Atheist Nomads. Please subscribe to the show in iTunes, Stitcher, or your podcatcher of choice, and while you're there, feel free to leave us a review. Theme music is courtesy of Sturdy Fred. Until next time, this has been the Atheist Nomads.